So today's training focuses on leadership for board members. And it's important to look at several issues in terms of what's the distinction between a board and a committee, and what can we do as board members to be more effective during the meetings. As a member of a board, and it doesn't matter if you're on the Serra International board, the council board, district board, or your club board, you are responsible for the entity and everything that happens within it. The Serra International bylaws, which are mirrored in most of the club bylaws, expressly say that the officers manage the affairs of the corporation and have the duties and authorities granted to them within the bylaws. So as the scripture tells us, we are many parts, but we're all one body. And now we are looking at the organizational structure of Serra. We have an international board, we have Serra councils, we have regional area trustees that oversee areas without Serra councils. Below that, we have district governors, and below those, we have Serra clubs. Every level of this organizational structure is important to the functioning of Serra. And we're going to primarily focus on boards in general, so I'm not going to go too deep on the hierarchy of the organization. But one of the things that I think is important for everyone to keep in mind, that while this is our organizational chart and the international board sits above everything, the functional chart of the functional structure of Serra is that everything exists to support the activity of the Serra Club. And in many ways, the structure of our organization mirrors the structure of the church, where the parish is the operating unit where most of the sacramental activity happens, where the community engagement occurs, and everything else exists to support that activity. You'll see that we have direct line communication between Serra clubs and Serra districts, and then those Serra districts should be talking to their councils or their area trustees, and those groups should be giving information to the Serra International board, which then works with the Serra International staff. The reality is there are dotted lines and dashed lines and zigzag lines, and our organization can be much flatter than this, where we at the office often have direct interaction with the staff, where someone has a question on a bylaws issue or on a matter of policy, on a program, and the staff exists to support all of Serra International in our mission to promote vocations to the priesthood and religious life. The board hires an executive director, that's me, to help with the management of the organization. To give everyone a bit of the backstory of Serra and our history, we were formed in 1935 by 4 Catholic laymen. Anecdotally, I've heard rumors that the reason Serra was formed is that these 4 gentlemen were not admitted into the Seattle Rotary Club because they were Catholics. And so they formed a group to address a need within the church. They saw that there was a need for supportive vocations from the laity, even back then. And in order to further help the board manage this, in 1947, due to Serra's rapid expansion, they hired Harry O'Hare as the first executive director. Mr. O'Hare held this post for nearly 30 years, and you can see his imprint on the organization even to this day. In the early stages, the executive helped the board in its governing and policy role, as well as overseeing the staff and the daily affairs, so the board could manage the bigger picture of Serra. And that is much in the same as what's happening today. So good board practice requires delegating and leading, and it is difficult to do both of those things, and it's even more difficult to do both of those things at the same time. Some things cannot be delegated to others. However, given the amount of work, it is often necessary to form committees or for boards to seek outside help with a variety of matters. So the treasurer of Serra International uses the resources of the office to help prepare the audits, the 990s. This is also true of the USA Council secretary, and many club many club treasurers use a third-party CPA in preparing IRS filings and other documents with the approval of the board, of course. So it's important to keep in mind that the board has a role to do, the office has a role to do, and we all exist to serve the mission of the church. So just to let everyone know what I'm here for, it's my job to carry out the policies, to manage the office, and to further provide assistance to Serra clubs, councils, and the foundation as directed by the board. The board has been very generous in terms of how this applies. So I serve as a resource to you, the members of the organization, and I've had the privilege of interacting and working with many of you throughout my tenure. I continue to look forward to this as we go forward. Also germane to today's discussion, given everyone's bent on learning things during the pandemic, I have begun the process of becoming a certified parliamentarian, or a registered parliamentarian, as they're called, because we're getting more and more bylaws questions from clubs as people get more engaged and more excited, which is a wonderful thing, because when people dig into the bylaws, it shows that they care about the organization and really want to do what's been set out and act within their purview. Conflict management is something that comes up in every board meeting and every interaction. It's hard to have a conversation between two people without some level of conflict creeping into it. So there's a huge diversity of leadership and vision within our organization, and that is both necessary and beneficial for the stewardship of our organization. Conflict can be a good thing and can often create wonderful and helpful ideas. So it's not something to be shied away from, but it needs to be managed properly. So feelings don't get hurt, so everyone can have their opinions heard, and so that we can really effectively run the organization, keeping everyone's opinion in mind. So debate over the pros and cons of an issue is almost always a good thing within a board meeting. Some ideas to help. You're never going to get full agreement, and if you are, it probably means a lot of people are not thinking or are not fully engaged. So a failure to get complete agreement is not a disaster. And as I mentioned, it may be more of a problem when everyone agrees on everything, because when that's happening, it's normally a sign that just a few people are fully running the show and other board members are less engaged than they need to be. It's always a good idea to work for a consensus, but say, we understand your position, but it's impossible to reconcile these two conflicting ideas, so we're going to have to go with what the majority of the board feels is important here. And the most important thing, and this is one of the most difficult things, is once the vote happens, you move on to the next issue and you put that behind you. You say, the board has spoken and we're going forward. Whether the board agrees with you, disagrees with you, takes 75% of your ideas but leaves the 25% that you think is the really crucial piece, it doesn't matter. The decision was made. So now it's your responsibility as a board member to represent and advocate for the position of the board. It's also important to remember conflict is not a defeat, and some of the most important and best ideas have come out of conflict and compromise. So you should try to incorporate that as much as possible. You've got a better chance of maintaining acceptance, credibility, and respectability when you show that you are willing to compromise on certain issues, and it can keep the faith of the board so that when future issues come up, people view you as a reasonable individual who's open to change or other opinions. And carrying on with conflict will do the exact opposite of that. So, as I mentioned before, after the vote is taken, you are an apostle of that consensus, and it's your job to advocate for it going forward. So, policy is something that is different from the bylaws. Policy is the guideline that helps the board stay within reasonable limits, and it is something that can be used to maintain consistency. But policy is a guideline. It is not a rule, and policy is something that the board can change from time to time given the needs of the organization. So the policy sets the course of action for the organization. If the board wants to set a policy that we will only give refunds for people who register for the seminary and cookout if they let us know 48 hours in advance because Bob needs to get so many hot dogs. That's a clear policy. There's a good rationale behind it, and that's something that can be articulated. So if there's an issue in the future, the board can refer to that policy. I encourage that all boards have and maintain a written policy manual so that everyone is aware of what the policies are. Many times clubs fall into the trap of saying, well, I think this is the way we've always done it. And memory is a wonderful but sometimes fuzzy thing. So it's advisable for boards to maintain written policy manuals to outline how the organization operates and what they are looking to accomplish. To understand the policy, you need to think about what are the issues, how could this be interpreted, how is this going to be effective, and what are the long-term consequences of this. Policy development is not a set it and forget it type of affair. Policy is something that the board should continuously review. I recommend every 2 to 3 years just to make sure that policy is doing what it's intended to do, and also to remind everyone on the board that we do have a policy manual and here is what it says on these issues. So it's the written statement that specifically says how you manage this or that. Developing policy takes a step-by-step process where the wording should probably be developed by a committee or a task force rather than having the full board do it. And we'll be talking about committees in a moment. Policy should always be presented to the board, and the board is the one that makes the final decision, but it doesn't have to accept the recommendation of a committee or a task force, and boards have the ability and the responsibility to send things back to a committee for further review and development if the board views that such review or modification is necessary. Policy is not bylaws. Your bylaws are the foundational underpinnings of the organization. And as those who were on the recent Mike Downey training session saw, the USA Council recently restated the model club bylaws so that we have a template document that all clubs can use for their base bylaws. Bylaws require a vote of the membership as well as approval of the council's bylaws committee and the executive director to be changed. So these are far more permanent than what policies are, and bylaws are normally reserved for bigger items like how many officers will serve on the board, what are the duties of those officers, what are their terms, what are the methods for electing officers, what happens with funding in the event of the dissolution of the club, and processes you want to be more finite and set in stone. So the board develops policy. It doesn't just write policy. Policy, as I mentioned, should be continuously reviewed and improved upon. When that doesn't happen, you wind up with everyone's seen the silly laws that come out. And up until about, I think it was 15 years ago, it was illegal to have a pig in the city of Chicago unless it had a ring in its nose. And that's a law that dates back to the 1800s when cattle kind of roamed the streets of the city. It's not really necessary anymore. And it was something that had been on the books so long that the fine for a violation of that section was $3. So even if you wanted to use that as a deterrent to having pigs without rings in their nose in the streets of the city, the fine doesn't line up with the value of currency at the time. To develop policy, you should first identify the need. And as I mentioned earlier, with the refund example for the seminary and cookout, the need is you want to make sure you don't buy more food than is necessary for the event and lose funds. Gather facts. How much time do we need before the event, before we can go out and get the supplies necessary? What does it take, and what are the complicating factors going on there? Deliberate the issue. Is it better to say we need a full week's notice in order to give us a really wide berth in the time that it takes to put this together, or can we impose upon our members a little bit and just give them that 48-hour window to do the purchasing? What's fair to all parties involved? Ask the question, is this consistent with our objectives and purposes? Is this within the scope of the board's authority? Is this compatible with other board policies? And is this something that is enforceable? All four of those are important questions that the board needs to consider when setting policy. Finally, if it's something regarding money, you need to ask, is this affordable? Is this something that we can manage within the resources of the club? Board committees. Committees are different from the board itself. And oftentimes the board will use committees to handle things that cannot be efficiently managed by a full board. Some Serra clubs have boards of upwards of 15 members. So it makes sense to break that out into smaller groups and assign specific committees with individuals who have the requisite skills and information to understand the issue and report back to the board. Service on committees is not limited to experts on the subject. It's often beneficial to have people who are just casual observers, because I've seen many times where committees, particularly bylaws committees comprised entirely of lawyers, put together wording that is legally bulletproof, but objectively incomprehensible to someone without a working knowledge of complex corporate law. So it's good to have diversity on those committees. It's also good to remember that committees inherently have no power or authority. They are only responsible to the full board, and they are always responsible to the full board. So the actions of committees are to study the issue and report their recommendation to the board. So the best way to do this is to get regular reports from a committee, not just assign a committee, say, come back to us in 6 months with your findings, and then have the board vote on them. If it's a particularly complex issue, it's good to have regular reports from your committee chairs so the board has a better understanding of what the committee's been doing and can make recommendations in terms of ways the committee could improve what it's doing or better effectuate the work that it has been assigned to do. There are many types of committees, and the bylaws, both Serra International, the council, and the clubs, provide for certain standing committees. These can be the programs, vocations, communications, and membership committees that most of us are familiar with. Some clubs require an audit committee to make sure that all of the club's finances are in line. And the standing committees are different from ad hoc committees. Standing committees are enshrined and ensconced in the bylaws of the club. And that means the club has said, this is an issue that is so important, we are going to have a standing and permanent committee to work on the development and recruitment of membership within the club. Sometimes there are special issues that come up that require committees, and these are ad hoc or purpose-specific committees or task forces. This could be a new bishop is coming in and we want to plan a major event to celebrate the ordination or installation of the bishop. So we'll set up an ad hoc committee to plan the events, to do fundraising for it, to promote it, to make our new ordinary feel very welcome here in his new home diocese. That's why one example of why you would need an ad hoc. Task forces are somewhat different from committees, as they put together a report, they submit it to the board, and then they generally are dissolved. Committees can be dissolved or reconstituted at any time by the will of the board. So the most common type of committee that Serra clubs interact with is the executive committee. The executive committee is usually the principal officers of the club, and by principal officers, I mean the non-trustee officers, president, president-elect, past president, secretary, and the vice president. Most club bylaws allow the executive committee to act with the full power of the board outside of board meetings. So there are circumstances where clubs limit the ability of the executive committee, and this usually relates to, again, big issues, litigation, expenditures over certain amounts, and those types of matters need to be brought before the full board for action. So as a committee member, you would have certain responsibilities, or you would need to make sure members of the committee understand their responsibilities. It's a serious thing, and you've got a job to do, and you are accountable to the board. Committee members or committee chairs in particular should be prepared to attend meetings, to answer questions, and to take part in them, even in cyberspace, just like we're doing now. I think one of the many blessings of what's going on right now is we're getting more acquainted with the tools of the time, and Serrans and Serra clubs are becoming more comfortable holding meetings virtually and remotely, enabling business to be conducted and allowing Serrans who could not otherwise participate in the meetings to be there. So it's always important to remind everyone that we all have jobs to do and we're all volunteers. So to be respectful of everyone's time, it's important that things get done when they need to be done. Or if someone cannot complete something in a timely manner, that they notify the board or the committee as quickly as possible so alternate arrangements can be made. And remind the committee that they are accountable to the board. One of the most important things that boards can do is plan for the future. I think the death knell of many a Serra club has been the phrase, but we've always done it that way. And we are a Catholic organization, and our traditions run deep and are very, very important to us. But as Serrans and as Serra club trustees, we need to look to the future and be able to adapt and incorporate new technologies, new events, and new ways of serving the mission of our organization so that we can fulfill the needs of the church, particularly as it relates to vocation. So there's a good amount of thinking and future gazing that needs to be done as a board member. It's important to realize that your own personal goals and visions and aspirations are maybe not the exact same as your fellow board members and as Serras. So we should all bring our personal views to the table and our unique and diverse perspectives, with the understanding that everyone else has those same views and those don't often align. So we need to be open to critiques of our ideas, just as we will likely be giving critiques of others' ideas. And one of the most critical fiduciary roles of the board is to monitor bottom line results. Are we using the organization's resources in a proper fashion? Are we being good stewards of the dues monies we've collected, of the donations we've received, and are we making progress towards our long-term plans? Those are all things to keep in mind in your service as a board member. So it's difficult but important to always check the budget before you make a proposal, because there are so many wonderful ideas that you have that struggle to get effectuated because we have limited means. And this is true at every level of the organization, from Serra clubs all the way up to Serra International. There are some things that are just beyond the means of our organization. So we need to work within our budget. It's important to review the reports so you can see what the board, what the organization's finances are doing, where is the money being spent, and sometimes ask the question, is this the most worthwhile use of our funding? Having the books audited by an outside group. This is something that is important, but I would caution that it will vary based on the size of your club. If you have a 350 person Serra club that does a $400,000 dinner dance every year, it makes sense financially and on every other level for you to have your books audited annually by an outside group. If you have an 8-person club that gives $50 to every seminarian once a year through candy sales that you guys generate after masses, it's a lot easier to have a lay person or to get just a simple EPA opinion letter every few years to make sure that everything is being used in line with the purposes of the organization, and that you have transparency and accountability for how funds are being used. And just to remind everyone here, all 3 of the larger corporate entities of Serra, Serra International, the United States Council, and the Serra International Foundation are audited annually by an independent third party, and those audits are available upon request. So if you'd like a copy of any or all of those audits, feel free to email me after this webinar. One of the areas where I've seen Serra clubs get into trouble the most is financial misconduct, or unfortunately putting too much faith in a treasurer. This hasn't happened recently, but in years past there have been instances where a treasurer used club funds for personal expenditures or for things that the treasurer thought was important but the club did not authorize, and that creates problems. The way to guard against that is to get not just financial statements as a board member, but also to ask for the bank reconciliations to make sure you can see money going in and money going out of the club's account. Many different clubs operate and many different organizations. Some follow Robert's Rules of Order with dogged obedience, and others are more relaxed and kind of let conversation flow between people. I am a little more conservative in my suggestion that clubs follow Robert's Rules of Order, if for no other reason than one of the most difficult jobs on a board is that of secretary. And following Robert's Rules of Order makes it much easier for the secretary to keep the minutes and for everyone in the meeting to follow the action as to what's going on. So every board member, not just the president, is responsible for a good meeting. The president's job is to chair the meeting and to keep the board on pace to effectuate the needs of the organization and make good decisions. Board members are responsible for being at the meetings. Showing up is really half the battle, and bringing in their diverse perspectives, being prepared for the meeting. And that means reviewing all documentations, looking at the agenda. Sometimes you'll need to do research before meetings to understand what's going on. And that will help you take part in discussions and provide valuable feedback while you are generating ideas and opportunities with your board members. Understanding parliamentary procedure. As I mentioned earlier, I've begun the process of being certified as a parliamentarian, following the traditional practices of the board. This goes back to the policy discussion earlier, where it's important to maintain that consistency. And that's something that's helped sustain our clubs as well as our church, because we have a history to rely upon. And that's something that we can always hearken back to. So it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. We're all here to serve the church and to serve Serra. And I mention this a lot because it's one of the things that I find board members struggle with the most. Setting your ego aside and focusing on what is truly the best interest of the organization. That's your primary responsibility as a member of a board. So good meetings happen before the meetings can be. Yes, I'm from Chicago, but this does not mean you have the meeting before you have the meeting and then you just show up and vote the way you were told to vote. That's not what this means. What it means is preparing for the meeting, reviewing all of the documents, understanding what's going on, doing some research if you need to, asking questions of the president or whoever prepared the agenda. If you say, well, I'm not sure what item 3 on the agenda is in reference to, can you give me more information on that? Understanding what you're do as a board member, as we've talked about earlier, and forming an opinion of issues that incorporate people who are not on the board. And this is something that gets more and more important the larger your club gets, because for certain large clubs, the rank and file membership, for lack of a better term, can sometimes think that they're just the peons and the board is up here and nobody cares what I think. So having board members go out and solicit opinions from people who are not on the board is a very good way of keeping your membership engaged and involved in the activities of the organization. So at the meetings, it is unethical to decide on how you're going to vote for an issue before you attend the meeting. It's also technically against Robert's Rules of Order. You cannot send someone to a meeting and say, I'm going to vote this down no matter what is said. And when you pause and think for a moment, that makes a lot of sense. The reason you're having the meeting, the reason you are discussing this issue is so that the board members can make a fully formed understanding and decision on whatever is before them. Doing that with a preconceived notion defeats the purpose of having the meeting. Otherwise, you could just do a vote by email and you wouldn't need to have the discussion. So you should not have, you can have a preconceived notion and you can, you can have your own opinion, and you're certainly within your rights to have that opinion at the meeting. But I advise everyone not to say, I'm voting this down no matter what, because I don't care what anyone says. This is just the way I'm going to do it. That defeats the purpose of having a meeting. So after the deliberation, you should come to your decision, and that will be conducted in accordance with Robert's Rules of Order. We'll be talking about those in just a moment. The agenda is one of the most important things for a meeting because that's what keeps everyone on pace and aware of what's going on. So it limits the discussion for a clear direction for the meeting, and it requires that the board discuss items that are approved and on the agenda. There is a way to add items to the agenda, and that's on my Robert's Rules cheat sheet a little later on. And reports to the board. Reports are beneficial and likely to come from either officers or committee members. These reports usually recommend an action for the board to take. So we formed the committee. The committee said, we think the best way to honor the incoming bishop is to have a parade down Main Street. And it'll cost $150,000. We can get the permits, we can do this, we can do that. And that's what the committee recommends. Once that recommendation happens, the board can ask questions of the committee, but it is up to the board to make the decision as to whether or not it makes sense for the club to hold a parade to honor the new bishop. Maybe he doesn't like parade, maybe it's very expensive, maybe there are reasons why that activity, which the committee thought was a good idea, is not congruent with the thinking of the board. And it is certainly within the board's right to ask those questions, to gather information, and to make that final decision. Motions are the way you formally request the board to take an action. Once a motion is seconded and restated by the president, the board begins discussion of the motion. This is an important step that is very often overlooked because you can have someone say, I move that we do this. And then someone will say, well, I don't know if I like that. And you'll have the discussion before the motion gets seconded. The reason why you do not want to do that is because if a motion is made and it is not seconded, then there's no need for discussion on it. The motion never goes before the board. So it takes a little bit of discipline, but when you are chairing meetings and for the benefit of your secretary, it's important that you say, Sue made a motion that this happened and Tim seconded that motion. That way, all of that can be clearly defined and captured within the minutes, and then the discussion will occur. So motions either come from committee reports, recommendations from staff or task forces, but any board member can make a motion as long as there is no other motion on the floor. Here's where we get into my cheat sheets for parliamentary procedure. How do we do this? How do we do that? And I will be sending these out in the follow-up email, which will have the skinnied down version of this recording. So to adjourn a meeting, you simply say, I move that we adjourn. You're not allowed to interrupt the speaker. You are required to get a second for that. And if you get a majority vote in favor of it, the meeting can be adjourned. If you want to take a break, then you say, I move that we recess the meeting until 12:15. And again, you can follow along the table here to see what kind of vote is required and what other actions need to be taken. So point of privilege is something that you can say if you want to sound very fancy during a meeting. If a room is too hot, too cold, if there's background noise or something else that's interfering with the meeting, you say point of privilege, I'd like to address the staticky microphone on the conference call, and then usually someone will take some kind of action to address that, much as I did with whatever that interference was. I muted everyone else, so we were able to resolve that issue. To suspend consideration of an issue, meaning if there's something that the board is discussing that should continue discussion, but the board for whatever reason cannot make a decision on, you say, I move that we table this matter. Once that is seconded and you have a majority of votes in favor of tabling the issue, then that is no longer up for discussion. It's a good idea to say, I move that we table this matter until, and then that allows the board time to either send it to committee for further discussion or to wait for some action or research that will provide the information needed. To end a debate on a matter, you say, I move to call the question, and if you get a second on that and a majority of the vote, then you are able to end the debate and call for a vote. These are all pretty self-explanatory. Postponing the matter and tabling the matter are kind of a difference without a parliamentary distinction. So many clubs like to say postpone just because that's clearer English than the parliamentary language of tabling. To amend a motion, and this will often happen where someone moves to do something and there's a general agreement on it, but something in the motion needs to be modified. You would say, I move to amend the motion by, and that would say specifying that the policy will be limited to this year's cookout, or saying that this will be effective as of some future date so as not to cause a problem with this previously scheduled event. There are two ways that motions can be amended. Here it says that a second is required, and that is true per Robert's Rules of Order. There's also the option for what is known as a friendly amendment, where you propose to modify the motion and the original person who proposed that motion said, I have no objection. So the original mover agrees to the amendment, eliminating the need for a second. So to introduce anything, you would say, I move that we talk about item 5 on the agenda, the budget. And then to object to a procedural issue, which hopefully no one runs into, you would say point of order, and then explain what the parliamentary issue at hand is. Usually the point of order objections are always, we've started discussion on a motion that we don't have a second for. So point of order, Mr. President, Susan made that motion. No one has seconded it yet. We've been discussing it for 5 minutes. I'd like us to either get a second on that motion or to move on to the next order of business. So to request information, you would say point of information. Again, these are the very formal Robert's Rules of Order language. You can also just raise your hand, wait to be recognized by the chair and say, I have a question, could I ask the committee about this? So to request a vote, there's a lot of different ways that this can be done. You can either say, I call the question, or I call for a division of the House. Again, if you're feeling very parliamentary and fancy. So to object, you say, I object to consideration of this because it's not proper for this. And we've already talked about tabling matters. So to consider something out of the scheduled order, you can always do that, and you can always modify the agenda. You would say, I move that we suspend the rules and consider this, or I move that we amend the agenda to allow this other item to happen. So those are some of the common issues and magic words that come up and are said for effective running of meetings. Finally, I'm going to end on voting. Once a motion has been discussed, the president calls the question and asks the board to vote. The results of the vote should always be recorded in the meeting, in the minutes of the meeting. You as a board member should abstain if you have a conflict of interest or if you are genuinely unable to form an opinion on the matter. And abstentions are important because they impact how voting gets calculated. So once the vote is taken, the president declares whether the motion is passed or defeated. and moves on to the next item of the agenda. A few things to be mindful of with voting. Serra Club bylaws require that you need to have a quorum of the board or the executive committee in order to hold a meeting. And they also require that you need to have a majority of that quorum in favor of a vote to have the motion pass. So to illustrate this with real numbers, if there are 9 people on a board and you call a meeting and you have 5 of them present, those 5 people constitute a quorum, so it is a legitimate meeting of the board. If there is then an item discussed before, or an item before that board, and those 5 people, when the question is called, 4 of them abstain and 1 of them votes, that 1 vote still carries the day because that is a majority of the votes cast by a quorum of the board. So whereas if the full board were sitting, you would need 5 votes for the motion to carry. In that instance, just the 1 vote of the sole person who did not abstain would be decisive on that matter. Also, as a general rule, the president as chair of the meeting is usually not someone who votes, as they are the chair and they're usually the decisive tiebreaker vote if that comes up.